So we're now on day 3 of implementing an Azure data solution. And this day we'll actually start off with orchestrating data movement with Azure Data Factory, which of course, Chris, again, is really important from considering these Azure data services from a data ingestion perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's quite interesting really, because at the end of day 2, we look at real-time processing of data. And at the beginning of day 3, we now, with Azure Data Factory, look at batch processing of data. So we've basically got 3 lessons to go through in this particular module. An introduction to Azure Data Factory, understanding the Data Factory components is the second lesson. And lesson 3, it was kind of, we could have spent days just on Azure Data Factory alone, right? Yep. Because it can integrate with so many different technologies. We made the call to go, hey, we're in the data and AI team. We're trying to look at data engineering as a role that can work with AI engineers and data scientists. So we decided to look at integrating Azure Data Factory with Azure Databricks.
Well, and it's also important that within the context of the case study that we actually make that story consistent. We did decide on a path of Databricks as part of the case study. So now we got to follow through on really bringing in that data using Azure Data Factory as well.
Exactly.
So, and I know there's a lot of things we'll be talking about around connections and linked
services.
So let's have a look at that.
Yeah, sure. So in lesson 1, it really is about setting the scene for Azure Data Factory. So the students should come out of this lesson understanding what Azure Data Factory is, what the process is for ingesting data, what the components are that do that, and then we just want to cover some Azure Data Factory security to be mindful of. So, really simple. It creates, orchestrates, and automates the movement, transformation, and or analysis of data through the cloud.
And then one of the key things we'll be covering as well is the ability for Data Factory to push down the compute to the actual source you're pulling the data from.
That's perfect, because and that's where the word orchestrate becomes really important, right? Because it does rely on the other data platform technologies to work through that. So once you understand that, we can talk about the process. You connect and collect the data. You transform and enrich it. However you may analyze it as well. You publish it. And then, for things that you automate on a regular basis, things can and do go wrong, right?
Execution,
so monitoring,
performance.
Exactly. So you got to monitor it as well. And then you'll go through the Azure Data Factory component, starting off at the bottom with link services. And with link services, these are essentially providing the connection information to various data platform technologies, be it Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Data Warehouse, those kind of technologies.
When I look at that activity there, it says there's an arrow that says runs on. What does that mean? Is that pushing down on the compute? Or is that activity running on that linked service? Or do we actually run some of that activity in Azure Data Factory itself?
So I think to understand that, you need to understand a few other components first to get to that. So in order to understand the activity, you need to understand, first of all, a data set, right? So a data set is a representation of a data item in a linked service, which could be a table, it could be a file, right? This is then where you can call your activities. Your activities is a compute operation that occurs on either a data set, so maybe you're doing some kind of transformation that produces some data, and maybe you consume some data to enrich it. But an activity could also run on a linked service like a Hadoop cluster.
It's a push down of compute.
It's a push down, So fundamentally, it's calling that capability. Now, you're going to have more than one activity, right? So pipelines effectively is a logical grouping of those activities that you can then schedule, you can manage, you can maintain. But you've also got to consider the integration of SQL Server integration services. So on top of this, you've got integration runtime to help with the integration of sys packages, but there's also control flow elements as well, where you can embed that within Azure Data Factory and parameters as well. From a security perspective, there is a dedicated Data Factory contributor role that gives them permissions to create, delete data factories, manage resources like all the components we've just talked about, and create support tickets. So it was really important to call that out as a separate...
Within the context of security.
The context of security for Azure Data Factory. Okay. So once you've done that, we can look at the Azure Data Factory components.
Sounds good.
Yeah, there's 5 lessons here, and I'll make an apology already. I'm not a big fan of build slides per se, but trying to get this content out in a way that was concise and compressed. Yeah, I apologise in advance if there's too much build slide, but it'll be worth it.
Let's have a look.
Yeah. So link services, right? Link services are link services, but it depends what you're using link services for. So with a link service, we could use it to call a data source. Now, there is too many to call out here, right? It's not for you to call out every single one. The point I'm making is there's a wide variety of data sources that a link service can point to, but you can also create link services to point to compute resources, which can include machine learning, MapReduce operations on HD Insight, cold store procedures even.
What's the difference between a source and a sink?
A source is the source of the data that's coming in. A sink is part of the process where it may be part of data ingestion as a... I'm not going to use this word staging area, but it could be acts as a landing to something else.
Okay.
We'll give you an example of a linked service. Now, you could do these using a wizard, if I'm being brutally honest with you. But, you know, behind in the background is JSON. So we wanted to give you an example of an Azure linked service for Azure SQL database, and the fact that there's a connection string in there. And if you're familiar with SQL Server, it should be very straightforward. But by contrast, Azure Blob Storage, there's different information because it's wanting the account name and the account key. And it's really just highlighting that, you know, with different link services.
But then if you're familiar with event hubs and so on, you're also familiar with storage keys and
exactly. Data sets, you know, first of all, you've got a data set name. Within that, you've got properties. Now, the properties will vary depending on what data, what link service you're referring to. So within the properties, one of the first things you're going to do is the type, whether it's an external to indicate that, and the link service name. So you're providing a link back to that. So if we think back to the previous slide where we had Azure SQL link service, storage link service, that's where you would call those names out. Beyond that, then, you've got to talk about the structure of the data itself by any names and the data types within there. And depending on the type that you choose will determine the type properties. So it's specific to the type. The availability is the frequency with the time slicing of the data and how frequently you're going to do that. And there is an interval with that can be defined as well. Policy is about the availability, which I'll go into in a later slide. I deliberately omitted it at this point. I just want to call out here that for completeness, you would define a policy within a data set, but we'll look at it later on. So time slicing data within the properties, right? Remember the availability on the previous slide? This is where we drill down into this. So within the frequency and the interval, we might use a time that's offset. So basically, we're going to process data every day, but at 6 a.m. Right? That's what the offset does. Style, availability again, the frequency is the day, but you're determining, well, are you picking the data at the end of the day or at the beginning? Yeah? And then anchor date time, where you're basically saying that you're doing it on an hourly basis. The interval is 23 hours with the start time as denoted there. So what you're saying is there's different ways that you can specify the availability of your data slices within that. Time slicing data, this is an example of one, right? So for completeness, we've got a data set called Azure Blob Input, right? And the properties for that is that it's an Azure Blob with a link service name called storage link service that we created earlier on. The type properties for that is the file name's called input.log, and it resides in a blob container called data container input. Yeah,
fair.
It's text format, column delimited. It's available every month.
Okay.
So there's an example, and here's a second example for a blob output.
Okay. Just
to give you different examples.
Okay.
So what kind of activities are you doing with this now that you understand that the various time slicing? Well, data movement is the most common one, right? It's a simple move of data from one store to another. Yep. To be fair, there is a wizard available for this. You could use the copy activity wizard. So you don't even have to get into the JSON at all.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But we kind of just felt that we know you guys can pick up wizards. You know, it's relatively straightforward. The second thing you might want to do is data transformation activities, where you're calling a compute resource to change or enhance data using that compute resource. And then, of course, you've got control activities, which are the control flow components that basically allow you to orchestrate those pipeline activities so you can chain them together in a sequence, you can branch them off, and so forth.
Fair
and
point.
you can do this either on demand or maybe you have a trigger that invokes that. Pipelines, here's an example of it. Well, it isn't an example. We talk about what it is. Pipelines is a grouping of logically related activities. They can be scheduled. The activities within it get executed, but they also can be managed and monitored as well. And that's important because when it comes to productionization of this, you're monitoring the pipelines. Now, an example of this looks absolutely massive, right? And I'm prepared to accept that, but persevere with it, right? The top part, name my first pipeline. You can see where that's going. It is the first Active Directory pipeline. Within this, you're using a HD Insight Hive type, right?
Yep, you get a query to kick it off.
Yeah, and because it's HD Insight, the properties are slightly different. So they want a script path to where the Hive query language file is. They want a link service to where that is and where the input data is in the partition table is. So once you've got that defined, you've got the input. So you've got Azure Blob Input, which is basically the name of a link service called Azure Blob Input. The output is Azure Blob Output because you've got a link service called Azure Blob Output. And so what you got is you've got Azure Blob Input, Azure Blob Output, and in the middle, you've got a HD Insight Hive that's processing that data. And then the policy, which was omitted last time, is saying, there's only one time this activity can execute that. If it fails the first time it executes it, I'm going to do 3 retries.
That's where you put a retry logic in.
Because you're just basically saying, let's do retry logic in case there's just some intermittent transient problem there. You're processing this on a monthly basis. The name of it is called Run Sample Hive Activity. The link service name is called HD Insight On-Demand Link Service, and that is probably a link service that's calling an on-demand HD Insight cluster. And then you've got your start and end time for the processing of that data.
Fair point.
Yeah. This could get really, really big, okay? Because that's just one activity. There could be multiple.
And you've really got to look at it again within the scope of what we envisioned within this 3-day course.
Exactly. Honestly, Azure Data Factory could be a 5-day course. It's that big.
Just like SQL Data Warehouse could be, SQL DB, you name it.
And I'd be interested to see where we go with this in FY20.
How many more days you want?
You keep throwing it at me, I'll keep creating it. We made the call in the spirit of the data and AI team that if we're going to look at Azure Data Factory, we wanted to do it where it could help a data engineer be productive in a data science project.
But also within the context of the case study that we have going through this course.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what we do here is we talk about how ADF, Azure Data Factory, can be used to ingest data and create a pipeline. We need to create a storage account. It could be a data lake store. It doesn't just have to be Azure storage account and an Azure Data Factory instance. And then we use ADF to orchestrate the data transformations using what's called the Databricks notebook activity. So the idea behind this is the first step we do is create your Azure Blob store or data lake store, depending on which one you prefer. 2, create your data factory. So you know that. You've done that in previous modules.
Yep.
Well, point 1. 3, you then create a data workflow pipeline, right? And then within Databricks, you add a Databricks workbook to that pipeline and then perform analysis on the data.
Okay.
So the way that looks is you create a storage account on the left.
Got it.
You create a new data factory on the right.
Yep.
Right? And then within ADF, you can use data transformation via ADF, and there is a notebook activity in there that takes you through the steps where you create a Databricks access token, add the notebook activity to a pipeline, connect it, and run it. Okay? My recommendation here is that because we know that Databricks is probably going to be new to a lot of your students, probably replay the lab for them in this example.
Okay. Because
it's not the MCT's capability I'm questioning. It's just going to be so new to the attending on the students.
Yep.
I don't expect many data scientists to be coming on this course.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And then you review questions. So the lab, orchestrating data movement with Azure Data Factory, is going to reinforce those objectives where you create an Azure Data Factory instance, you start adding linked services in, and you're doing it in the context of Azure Databricks, right? Now at this point, you've seen a lot of slides now where it's all the same, it's the scenario and so forth.
Okay.
So we don't feel the same.
But, so yeah, that pretty much takes us to the end of this module.
Yeah.
Do we want to have a look? Is there some additional videos you recommend or people have a look at as well?
So you'll go through the module summary with the students so they should know what Azure Data Factory is. They should definitely understand the components. And, you know, they understand how they can use Azure Data Factory with Databricks. And I would highly recommend you ask the students to read the white paper on the data migration from on-premises to data warehouse using Azure Data Factory, because it's a really good white paper.
And then I think I mentioned that earlier or mentioned that offline as well. One of the things we should look into that as well is look at a learning path on Learn to really drill down into more capabilities with Azure Data Factory.
Yeah.
More from like a micro-learning perspective.
Yeah.
So yeah, with that, I think this really wraps up this module. And then let's have a look at what other modules we got left for today.